20 years ago, a 14-year-old girl vanished right on the familiar road from school to home, disappearing completely, without a trace, leaving her family and the entire Fort Collins community plunged into terror. Authorities suspected a man who had been seen around the school area was involved, but there was no clear evidence, no cameras, no witnesses, and the investigation quickly stalled. Yet throughout those long, endless years, Kayla's mother never gave up hope, always believing that the truth was still somewhere among the dusty case files. Then one day, when forensic technology reached a new level, an important detail in what seemed like useless evidence suddenly emerged. A detail overlooked for 2 decades, and it would turn the entire case upside down in a way no one could have expected. Before diving deep into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit subscribe to support the channel. In the early fall of 2003, Fort Collins lay quiet under a sunset streaked with copper hues and chilly winds blowing in from the Rockies. The familiar sounds of dismissal rang throughout the grounds of Lesser Middle School as students poured out of classrooms, everyone rushing home before the earlier darkness of the cooling season set in. Amid that crowd, 14-year-old Kayla Turner walked briskly through the school gate, with her black backpack neatly strapped on her shoulder, her demeanor light and calm as on any other school day. Kayla left school along the familiar route she had taken for years, crossing a few blocks to the east, then turning onto Spring Creek Trail, a lush green path running through the residential area, known for its tranquility and as a spot where locals often walk dogs or bike for relaxation. It was the shortest and safest way home, to the point that the Turner family rarely worried about Kayla walking alone in the afternoon. A few other students had seen Kayla turn onto the start of the trail, walking quickly but with no unusual signs. She didn't stop to chat with anyone, nor did she show any signs of fear or hesitation. Kayla's image blended into the laughter and the wind rustling through the trees along the path, all bearing the appearance of a completely ordinary dismissal. But that normalcy only lasted until Kayla didn't return on time. Inside the Turners' small home, a vague unease began to emerge when dinner was ready and Kayla was still not back. That amount of time usually didn't worry them too much. Sometimes Kayla would linger in class, to turn in a late assignment or stop at the convenience store near home for a few small items. However, as darkness fell and the home phone remained silent, the waiting began to feel uncomfortable. Her mother tried calling Kayla's 2 close friends, hoping she had stopped by someone's house, but both said they had left school before Kayla and hadn't seen her since then. A tense feeling began to creep into the air inside the home. Things could still just be a misunderstanding, they reassured themselves that way, but the prolonged silence made worry replace any rational explanation. Kayla's father decided to go out walking along the route she took every day. He scanned the lawns, the familiar street corners, searching for any sign that might reassure him Kayla was just nearby. Her mother also called a few neighbors, asking if anyone had seen Kayla pass by, but every answer was the same. No one had seen her return after school. Darkness began to cover the streets, and lights from the street lamps turned on one by one. There were no footprints, no answering calls, no clues to hold on to. The worry had turned into real fear. Kayla Turner never came home late without letting someone know. She wasn't the type of student who hung out idly, let alone someone who liked adventure. Every routine in Kayla's life contradicted the idea of her vanishing silently like that. The whole family returned home after more than an hour of fruitless searching, each carrying worry on their face. They gathered in the living room, discussing hurriedly but unable to come up with any reasonable explanation. No one clung to the hope that Kayla had simply stayed at school. All signs pointed to this being beyond the family's ability to search on their own. In a state of both panic and determination, they picked up the phone and called the Fort Collins police to report that Kayla Turner was missing. Right after the Turner family reported Kayla missing to the police, the atmosphere in Fort Collins quickly shifted to urgency. The city police took the information and immediately opened a missing person file, as the case of a 14-year-old girl disappearing right after school was always considered high risk. Basic details about Kayla, appearance, clothing, when leaving school, usual route, places she frequented, were quickly recorded as the basis for the initial response. Nearby patrol units were dispatched to areas where Kayla might appear, while the police internal communication system also issued alerts, so all teams knew about the case. The route Kayla took daily was seen as the focus of the search. A group of officers began combing the road from Lesher Middle School eastward through the city, crossing low-rise residential blocks and the quiet streets, typical of Fort Collins. From there, they continued into the Spring Creek Trail area, often visited by locals but with some dimly lit sections and fewer passers-by at the end of the day. The check started from the most visible spots: roadside lawns and areas where traces might be left if Kayla had tripped, been detained, or dropped items. At the same time, another team was assigned to go door to door in the neighborhood near the school for information. Many families were still preparing dinner and completely surprised when police knocked asking if they had seen a girl walking by. Most residents reported not noticing or having been inside early. However, a few neighbors said they had seen students passing around dismissal time, but weren't sure who was who. These statements were vague, but still recorded for later comparison. At the Spring Creek Trail area, the terrain's complexity made the search more difficult. The path wound through many twisting sections, some points obscured by bushes or small dirt paths branching off. A K-9 unit was deployed in hopes of tracking Kayla's scent, but the human smells from the many locals using the trail daily made the signals unclear. Still, the police dogs led officers to an area along the trail edge, where they found a small green item mixed in dry leaves. Closer inspection revealed it was a small decoration once attached to a backpack zipper, the same type Kayla usually carried. Police noted the location, marked it, and continued scanning the area more thoroughly. The search expanded to nearby parks. Roland Moore Park, a spot where many students gathered, was combed through every area, from playgrounds and benches to low bushes along the path. However, everything was empty, with no direct signs related to Kayla. Some afternoon joggers remembered seeing a young girl walking alone around dismissal time, but they couldn't confirm if it was Kayla, as the path often had students pass. Meanwhile, the investigation team continued gathering statements from those living near the trail. One witness said they saw a girl with a backpack walking quickly at the trailhead, but didn't remember the next direction clearly. Another mentioned seeing a few cars parked near the trailhead in the afternoon, but couldn't recall plates or colors. This information, though vague, was still recorded by police as puzzle pieces without clear shapes yet. Police also checked areas around the school, including backyards of buildings and side paths. Students might take as shortcuts, but no noteworthy evidence. By nightfall, Kayla's belongings were only found sporadically, not enough to determine which way she went after leaving Spring Creek Trail. No distress calls, no one confirmed talking to Kayla after school, and no clear signs she left the area by vehicle. After many hours of continuous searching without finding her whereabouts, police temporarily narrowed the scope to prepare coordination with more specialized units. A tense atmosphere enveloped the neighborhood as news of a missing girl spread quickly. But for the authorities, the most urgent question remained unanswered. Where had Kayla vanished, and what happened on that familiar road? The initial search efforts yielding no clear results forced Fort Collins police to expand the scope. Kayla leaving no clear traces on her usual route raised the possibility she had left the school vicinity in an undetermined direction based on the scant witness information. Early the next morning, police mobilized more personnel, coordinating with search and rescue teams to sweep wider areas, including forests, side trails and complex terrain leading to the outskirts of Fort Collins. Horsetooth Mountain Park, a vast forested mountain area west of the city, quickly made the priority list. It featured diverse terrain, intertwined trails and little-known side paths. Though far from Kayla's usual route, in cases where she might have been taken away by someone else, checking remote spots like Horsetooth was necessary. Search teams divided into many groups, systematically combing grid by grid to avoid missing any area. As they moved deeper into Horsetooth's trails, groups began noting suspicious points like scattered rocks, trampled soil or broken branches. But most such traces could be from hikers, bikers or wildlife, making direction determination hard. Still, every clue, no matter how small, was carefully recorded since the possibility they related to Kayla's disappearance couldn't be fully ruled out. By midday, as sunlight filtered through thinning forest canopy, a hiker called 911 reporting something unusual near a low mound beside the trail. The caller's descriptions led police to see a high chance it was a body. Immediately, the nearest units were dispatched to the marked location. Upon arrival, they discovered the body of a young girl in a narrow open space, partially obscured by grass and dry branches. Police quickly approached and performed initial verification steps. Clothing and remaining personal items on the victim helped them swiftly conclude this was Kayla Turner, the girl missing since the previous afternoon. This information was reported back to command, triggering rapid deployment of investigation and forensic units to the scene. The once quiet forest atmosphere was disrupted by authorities' presence, but all activities proceeded cautiously to preserve on-site traces. Upon confirming the victim's identity, police immediately cordoned off the scene in a wide radius to prevent locals or passers-by from accidentally disturbing key traces. Every trail around the body location was blocked with warning tape. Investigators noted the body's position, soil quality, surrounding objects, and any signs of movement or concealment. Though just preliminary trace collection, every detail became crucial in reconstructing what happened to Kayla. Some nearby traces like broken branches, disturbed soil, and a few fabric threads on bushes were temporarily noted for later forensic process. These elements couldn't yield immediate conclusions, but they would play a key role in analyzing whether the body was placed here or if this was the site of the entire incident. Photography, marking, and scene mapping steps were carefully conducted by the CSI team, ensuring everything in the area was accurately recorded for the investigation. Though police always hoped to find Kayla alive, when the body was discovered, that emotion quickly gave way to the high focus needed in a homicide case. The question now was no longer where Kayla was, but what happened to her, and how she ended up in this unfamiliar spot amid the forest. Initial traces weren't enough to answer, but that day's scene was the starting point for a long investigation journey, where even the smallest details could become the key to the truth. The discovery of Kayla's body at Horsetooth Mountain Park prompted the entire law enforcement team to shift into a full-scale investigation mode, and the critical first step after securing the scene was to transport the body to the Larimer County Coroner's Office for an autopsy. As soon as they received confirmation from police identifying the victim, the forensic team prepared the examination room and necessary equipment. Since cases involving minor victims are always prioritized for rapid processing to preserve evidence integrity and minimize the effects of time on biological samples. In the autopsy suite, the overall evaluation of the body followed standard protocol. The medical examiner first assessed the external condition: clothing torn in several places, abrasions on the arms and legs, and some abnormal marks on the neck and head area. These traces suggested that Kayla may have struggled or been dragged somewhere before her body was placed at the discovery site. Though only preliminary observations, they formed the initial assumptions that the girl had undergone a violent attack. As the examination expanded, the medical examiner focused on areas directly impacted. The injuries to the neck and head indicated signs of forceful assault, most likely the cause of death. Certain bruises and soft tissue damage suggested the victim may have been restrained or forced during the incident. All wounds were carefully photographed and measured for later analysis. Next, the medical examiner checked for signs related to sexual assault. This step is mandatory in cases of young victims found under suspicious circumstances. Samples were collected from various locations on Kayla's body to search for any remaining biological evidence from the perpetrator. Preliminary testing in the autopsy suite revealed clear signs that Kayla had been sexually assaulted before death. This immediately classified the case as a homicide with sexual motivation, a factor that would directly influence the subsequent investigation direction. The biological samples were collected under strict protocol: cotton swabs from suspected areas, samples from under the fingernails, hair samples, fibers clinging to the skin and clothing, along with any material that might contain the attacker's DNA. Among the collected samples, the forensic team quickly noted one containing indications of male DNA. This was considered the most crucial type of evidence for identifying a suspect when there were no direct witnesses or surveillance footage. After completing sample collection, the medical examiner proceeded to internal examination to confirm the cause of death. Signs of airway obstruction and soft tissue damage in the neck area indicated Kayla was most likely strangled or subjected to strong pressure there, leading to asphyxiation. The official conclusion after full analysis was, Kayla Turner's cause of death was forceful impact to the neck region, combined with other injuries proving this was an intentional homicide. Once the male DNA sample was extracted and standardized, the lab submitted the profile to the CUDIS system for comparison. This was a vital step, as if the perpetrator had ever been arrested, required to provide DNA, or involved in sexual crimes, the system could yield a match relatively quickly. However, the result came back as no hit. No records in the system matched the DNA sample from Kayla's body. This meant the attacker had no prior record in the national or Colorado state DNA database at that time, making suspect identification far more difficult. Nevertheless, obtaining the male DNA profile was a major advancement in the case. The forensic report was completed with full details on injuries, cause of death, signs of sexual assault, collected biological samples, and CUDIS comparison result. Everything was forwarded to the investigative unit for inclusion in the Kayla Turner case file. The forensic report was not just confirmatory, but became the foundation for all subsequent investigative directions. Every detail, from wound locations to the DNA sample, played a key role in the journey to find the responsible party. But at that moment, despite confirming the cause of death and finding critical biological evidence, the path ahead remained unclear. The perpetrator's identity was completely unknown, and the Kayla Turner case officially entered a highly challenging phase. When the forensic report was returned to the investigative unit, the initial hope was that key details from the autopsy would open clearer paths forward. But immediately, the Fort Collins investigative team faced a harsh reality. Despite having a male DNA sample and confirmation of a serious homicide, they had no direct leads pointing to the perpetrator's identity. The lack of a CUDIS match turned what police had pinned their highest hopes on into essentially a dead end. In 2003, Fort Collins lacked public surveillance cameras like larger cities, and families around the school, or along Kayla's usual route, rarely had recording devices. The investigative team revisited areas around Lesher Middle School, major roads near Spring Creek Trail, and key intersections, hoping for footage from stores or gas stations that might capture Kayla or any suspicious vehicles. However, all checked locations provided no clips from the time of Kayla's disappearance. The complete absence of imagery meant police could not reconstruct the girl's final movements using technical means. With no other options, authorities focused on traditional methods, canvassing statements from area residents. They returned to homes previously visited during the initial search phase, this time emphasizing potentially overlooked detail. Some witnesses recalled seeing a few students passing the trail, but no one could confirm if it was Kayla. These statements were mostly vague and offered no valuable descriptions, only highlighting that Kayla's chosen route was highly popular, making it hard to isolate traces. During canvassing, police compiled a list of individuals living or appearing near the school area when Kayla was still attending. The list included neighborhood residents, construction workers who had been nearby, employees at adjacent stores, and individuals previously noted for suspicious behavior in the area. Some were considered potential suspects, but when cross-referenced with scene details and the forensic report, none had direct connections or evidence warranting deeper scrutiny. On that list, the name Stephen Mark Rudd appeared as noteworthy. Rudd's mother lived across from Lesher Middle School, which placed him in initial canvas notes due to being seen around the school at various times. However, when questioned by police, Rudd stated he only visited his mother infrequently and denied being in the area the afternoon Kayla vanished. Without cameras, direct witnesses or physical evidence linking him to the scene or Kayla's route, police could not advance in verifying or ruling out his involvement. The male DNA from Kayla's body was the most prominent element, but the CUDIS no-hit meant it couldn't be compared against anyone on the suspect list. None of those examined had ever provided DNA samples to authorities for direct comparison. Forensic technology in 2003 was also not advanced enough to allow deeper analysis of the sample to narrow suspects by other characteristics. No match meant no guiding sign, paralyzing in-depth investigative effort. Police also considered the possibility of a stranger attack, but this expanded the suspect pool to nearly unmanageable levels. Meanwhile, vague clues in the woods where the body was found, disturbed soil, broken branches, a few fabric fibers, were not strong enough to lead to specific conclusions about the perpetrator's identity or how Kayla was transported. After weeks of continuously reviewing statements, areas, evidence, plus inability to narrow the suspect list via DNA or cameras, the investigation gradually stalled. The case remained open, but with no new directions, no breakthroughs, and no signs the perpetrator had left an obvious mistake. All initially collected materials were carefully archived, but all police could do was wait for a new lead to emerge, something that unfortunately would take many years to materialize. The prolonged deadlock following the initial investigation led Fort Collins authorities to realize they had no viable leads left to pursue the killer of Kayla Turner. In the first weeks after the body was discovered, police still tried recanvassing statements, cross-checking notes, even returning to some scene areas for final checks on overlooked details. But every effort yielded no new paths. The male DNA didn't match anyone, the suspect list had no fits, and the scene lacked traces strong enough for deeper investigation. The case fell into a frightening silence. Over time, initial case information grew cold. No new witnesses emerged. No one reported suspicious behavior potentially linked to Rudd or anyone else on the suspect list. Media outlets that had covered Kayla's death tapered off, and the case drifted into obscurity, not forgotten internally, but lacking any new data or technology to break the impasse at that time. In subsequent years, new detectives assigned to Fort Collins PD occasionally reviewed Kayla's file as part of routine cold case checks, but each time the thick file was opened, they reached the same conclusion: nothing more could be done. Evidence collected: early fibers, soil samples, DNA, Kayla's clothing, scene notes was meticulously preserved in storage. However, forensic technology then wasn't advanced enough to extract more from these items. They were stored per protocol, periodically checked to prevent degradation or contamination, but yielded no additional data. A few years after the case opened, with investigators exhausted of options, Fort Collins police made the official decision: Kayla Turner's file was transferred to the Colorado Cold Case Database, the state's specialized system for long unsolved cases, lacking active lead. This decision wasn't closure but an acknowledgement that the case temporarily exceeded available tools for resolution. Moving a case to cold case status doesn't mean it's abandoned, but it changes priority and handling. The local unit no longer maintained direct oversight, shifting periodic review responsibility to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI cold case team. From then on, Kayla Turner's file would be reopened upon new technology, data, information from other cases, or matches to a perpetrator's later activities. Time passed year after year with no significant development. Original investigators transferred or retired. New ones accessing the file could only reread pages dense with signatures, marks and notes, then return them to cold metal cabinets mirroring the case's status. Every once promising lead remained at suspicion level, and the only notable suspect, Stephen Mark Rudd, left no further traces or behaviors for police to revisit. Still, all Kayla-related evidence was securely stored, strictly following multi-layer sealing protocol. This was most critical, as no one knew when new technology might emerge, but evidence needed to remain intact for future reanalysis. The faint hope of those remembering the case rested there. Evidence intact meant hope, though small, wasn't fully extinguished. For over a decade after cold case designation, Fort Collins changed greatly. Population grew, infrastructure expanded, technology became ubiquitous. But Kayla Turner's case remained in an old storage drawer, awaiting an opportunity no one knew when would come. And this prolonged silence created a hazy gap between the present and Kayla's disappearance day. A gap only breakable when science and technology grew strong enough to illuminate traces thought long dormant. In the years that Kayla Turner's case file lay dormant in Colorado's cold case list, advancements in forensic science continued to develop without pause. Initially, those changes were not enough to break the long-standing deadlock, but after 2018, a series of improvements in legal regulations and DNA technology created a significant turning point, opening new opportunities for cases that seemed to have faded into oblivion. It was this change that formed the foundation for bringing Kayla's case back to the investigators' desks, even though nearly 2 decades had passed since the little girl was murdered. In 2018, Colorado passed important amendments related to the collection of DNA samples from individuals arrested or convicted in violent crimes. Previously, the law only required DNA collection in limited cases, leaving large gaps in the state and national CODIS database system. Many offenders who had been convicted but had never provided DNA samples could not be matched to prior cases. Expanding these regulations meant that thousands of new DNA samples were added to the system each year, increasing the chances of finding unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated cases. Alongside legal changes, DNA analysis technology also achieved remarkable leaps forward. New techniques such as next-generation sequencing, NGS, YS-TOR profiling, and the ability to analyze trace amounts, touch DNA, became powerful tools in solving old cases. These methods allowed for clearer DNA extraction from very small or degraded samples over time, something that the technology in 2003 was completely incapable of doing. As a result, many cold cases across the United States began to be reopened, as evidence once deemed unanalyzable now became a valuable source of information. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation (CBI) clearly recognized the potential from these changes and established a program to review all old cases that had collected biological samples, especially those involving young victims or with elements of sexual assault. A team of investigators and forensic experts dedicated to cold cases was tasked with examining hundreds of backlog files, re-evaluating each one based on the potential application of new technology. Files that had previously stalled due to lack of matches in CODIS now became prime candidates for comprehensive reanalysis. In that review process, the Kayla Turner case quickly drew attention. What made Kayla's file fit the priority criteria was the presence of a clear male DNA sample, collected according to 2003 standards and well preserved in the evidence vault. Although this DNA sample had yielded no matches when entered into CODIS years earlier, with new technology, deeper extraction or a more detailed profile was entirely possible. Additionally, the fact that Kayla was a minor victim further placed the case in the highest priority group for reanalysis. Beyond technical factors, CBI's practical experience also showed that long-standing cases with male DNA samples were often the ones with the greatest potential for resolution when new technology was applied. There had been many cases nationwide where DNA did not match in the past, but updates to the database from subsequent arrests or convictions of offenders led to unexpected hits. Therefore, including Kayla's case in the reanalysis list was not just a scientific step, but also a strategic decision by the cold case team. Thanks to the combination of legal changes, scientific progress, and experience in handling long-dormant cases, Kayla Turner's file, after nearly 20 years gathering dust in storage, finally returned to the investigators. This was the first time in many years that the case had a real chance to see the light again. And when the files were opened once more, the evidence that seemed to have been sleeping suddenly became the focus of a new investigation, marking the beginning of a phase that no one could have predicted would lead to identifying the perpetrator after nearly 2 decades of silence. When CBI's program to review backlog cases was implemented and Kayla Turner's file was placed on the priority list, the case was assigned to investigator Sharon Whitlow, one of the veteran members of the cold case unit. Upon receiving the file, Whitlow understood that she was dealing with one of the cases that had once shocked Fort Collins, but also one of the most difficult due to the lack of leads from the very beginning. However, the existence of the male DNA sample in the forensic report gave her confidence that this case was worth investing full effort, because in the modern forensic world, a DNA sample could change the entire landscape. Whitlow's first step was to reopen all the original documents, crime scene reports, photographs, diagrams, statements, old forensic reports, and the 2003 suspect list. The pages had yellowed with time, but they retained their full value. Whitlow read every line, reviewing every note from previous investigators, trying to reconstruct the entire sequence of events from the moment Kayla left school until her body was found. The more she read, the more she realized that the case lacked not effort, but the appropriate technology at the time. Once she understood the context, Whitlow shifted her focus to the sealed evidence, as that was the real key. She requested that the evidence storage department open the vault and bring out all items related to Kayla's case for inventory. The evidence boxes, sealed with multiple layers according to 2003 standards, remained intact thanks to strict preservation procedure. The DNA sample bags, Kayla's clothing, soil samples from the scene, fiber samples, fingernail scrapings, and small items collected from the Spring Creek Trail area, all were placed on a long table in a temporary examination room. Whitlow examined each item one by one, assessing their potential remaining value. Some biological samples had degraded over time, but many, especially the swabs taken from Kayla's body, were still intact enough for reanalysis. With new technology, other physical evidence, such as clothing, soil and fibers, was also checked for potential expanded analysis, if combined with additional forensic techniques. With her experience, Whitlow knew that every piece of evidence had the potential to yield new information if processed with modern equipment. One of the most important discoveries during the review was the sample containing the 2003 male DNA profile. This sample had been submitted to CODIS, but yielded no match, making it a frozen puzzle piece for nearly 2 decades. But with current NGS and YSTR technology, Whitlow knew that this sample could be analyzed in much greater detail. She did not expect the DNA sample to provide an immediate answer, but she was certain it was the only starting point capable of breaking the case's long silence. After examining all the evidence, Whitlow developed a detailed plan for the next steps. The evidence list was grouped by testing potential, group needing DNA reanalysis, group with potential supporting analysis, soil fiber, group no longer usable. She noted everything carefully, ensuring every sample was handled according to proper chain of custody procedures to preserve future legal value. The most important decision during that review session was made when Whitlow called CBI's partnering lab and requested retesting of all DNA samples collected from Kayla's body, especially the male sample. She prepared the necessary documents, signed the retest request confirmation, and handed over the evidence according to strict preservation protocols. In the file sent to the lab, Whitlow emphasized that this was key evidence from a case nearly 20 years old, and requested priority processing as soon as possible. As the evidence boxes were resealed and loaded onto a specialized vehicle for transport to the DNA testing lab, Whitlow watched them leave the vault with a mixture of pressure and hope. She knew that the work she had just done was not a formality in reopening the file, but the true first step in the journey to find the truth. If the DNA retest could reveal even one new piece of data, Kayla Turner's case would have a chance to be resolved after 20 years stuck in the dark. The evidence boxes transferred by Sharon Whitlow did not take long to reach CBI's DNA testing lab, where forensic technicians had been pre-notified about the priority level of the file. Reanalyzing a case, nearly 2 decades old, always carried special significance, not only for its meaning to the victim's family, but also for the potential to solve it when modern technology could clarify details once considered undeterminable. When the evidence was brought into the cold room, the seals were checked and cross-referenced with the chain of custody records, and the official analysis process began. The technicians chose to focus first on the male DNA sample collected from Kayla's body. This sample had been analyzed using basic STR methods at the time of the crime, but the data generated then was too limited to yield clear results. The technology at that time only produced a fragmented profile, insufficient to distinguish suspect characteristics or aid in narrowing the search. But with the modern equipment of 2020, everything had completely changed. The analysis process began with re-extracting DNA from the old sample. Under good preservation conditions over 20 years, the sample retained enough integrity to perform more complex methods. The technicians used next-generation extraction processes to remove impurities and obtain purer DNA than before. Then the sample was run through a quantifier to determine the amount of usable DNA, helping to select the appropriate amplification strategy for subsequent steps. Once the preliminary data was stable, the next step was DNA amplification using next-generation PCR systems. Genetic markers including traditional STR loci and YSTR sequences, specific to male DNA, were analyzed in parallel. Next-generation sequencing (NGS) technology was applied to increase data accuracy and detail. Instead of just producing a simple coding sequence like before, the NGS system allowed for creating a DNA profile with hundreds of identifying features, distinguishing individuals much more clearly than the original technology. During the machine run, screens in the lab displayed thousands of decoded nucleotide sequences. Because this was evidence from a case involving a minor victim, every step was performed with absolute caution. The complete analysis took many hours, but when the final data was successfully compiled, the lab had a male DNA profile that was far more detailed and complete than the one created in. This new profile not only included basic markers but also had high resolution, enough to distinguish suspects even when CODIS data was incomplete. This was a major advantage of modern technology, Many past cases did not match due to raw or missing marker data, but when a more complete profile was added, the system could match more accurately. After completing the analysis, the dedicated department created a standardized file to submit to the state and national CODIS systems. The data was final checked to ensure no errors in format conversion. When all parameters met FBI standards, the technician officially ran the automated comparison, a process that scans the entire database of DNA profiles collected from offenders, convicted individuals, arrestees, and samples related to other cases. Submitting the profile to CODIS was not a step that provided an immediate answer, but it was the most critical moment in the entire reanalysis process. After nearly 20 years, the male DNA sample was finally entered into the system, with sufficient detail to potentially generate a real hit. The lab notified Whitlow that the data had been submitted and the comparison was being processed under special priority protocols for serious cases involving minors. Whitlow received the news in a state of both hope and caution. She understood that a match result did not always appear immediately. Some files had to wait weeks or months for full analysis, or for other states to update new data. But she also knew that if modern technology could do what was impossible 20 years ago, this was the first step in bringing Kayla Turner's case out of the darkness. And only one question remained in the minds of everyone involved in the retest process. Would the system find someone to match this time? The answer, though not yet apparent, had begun to shift when the DNA of an unknown perpetrator was finally brought back into the light of modern forensic technology. The CODIS match results came back just a few days after the lab finished uploading the new DNA profile, much faster than Sharon Whitlow had anticipated. Early that morning she received notification from the testing unit. The system had detected a match with the male DNA sample recovered from Kayla Turner's body. This was the moment all the weeks of retesting effort had been building toward. Whitlow immediately headed to the lab to review the detailed report, and when the suspect's name appeared on the screen, she knew she was facing the biggest breakthrough since the case had been reopened. The name on the match result was Stephen Mark Rudd. CODIS records showed that Rudd's DNA had been entered into the system after 2021, when a sample was collected from him upon his release from prison in a case involving forceful residential burglary. Without Colorado's new law requiring DNA collection from all violent offenders, Rudd's genetic code might never have been added to the database, and the Kayla Turner case would likely have remained in the dark, just as it had for nearly 2 decades. Whitlow carefully reviewed the match profile to ensure there were no system errors. The genetic markers aligned perfectly with the sample taken from Kayla's body. The accuracy met the absolute standard of current forensic science. There was no doubt left. The man named Stephen Mark Rudd was the source of the DNA found on the 14-year-old girl's body in 2000. This result moved the case into a new chapter, one where the perpetrator's identity was no longer a mystery, but a fact confirmed by technology. What made this discovery even more striking was that Rudd was not a completely unfamiliar name from the old files. When reopening the 2003 suspect list, Whitlow found his name briefly noted on the 3rd page of the document. The note at the time indicated that Rudd had been seen around Lesher Middle School on various occasions because his mother lived directly across from the school. However, the investigators that year could find no statements or physical evidence directly linking him to the crime. When questioned in 2003, Rudd denied being in the area at the time of Kayla's disappearance, and the lack of a DNA match gave police no reason to hold him. He was noted and then removed from the priority suspect group. Whitlow flipped through the old documents with a heavy but determined mood. 20 years earlier, Rudd had been right in the police's sights, but they couldn't go further due to technological limitations. And now that same technology, in a more advanced form, had brought him back to the center of the case. This coincidence was both bitter and a testament to the importance of preserving evidence and updating CODIS data over time. The CODIS match report not only identified Rudd but also provided details about his prior conviction. Records showed he had been convicted of violent offenses and residential burglary in 1996, serving a long sentence but released early following a 2021 law change. This explained why his DNA appeared in the system only after that point, not before. If CODIS had been as comprehensive back then as it is now, the Kayla case might have been solved long ago. After cross-checking the old files, Whitlow immediately reported the discovery to her superiors and recommended a full investigation into Rudd. Although the DNA match was nearly irrefutable evidence, legal procedures required gathering additional information before seeking an arrest warrant or conducting an interrogation. The cold case team held an emergency meeting where Whitlow presented the entire retesting process, the chain of custody for the evidence, and the absolute CODIS match result. The decision was made right in that meeting. The Kayla Turner case was officially reopened for investigation, this time with Stephen Mark Rudd as the primary suspect. Old data was merged with CODIS information, and a special investigative team was formed to re-examine the entire 2003 timeline, from Rudd's known locations, habits and movements to any suspicious behavior around the school area. The CODIS match was not just a major step forward, it was the breakthrough that pulled the case out of 2 decades of deadlock. With the suspect's identity now clear, all the investigative team needed to do now was rebuild the entire picture of the crime with Rudd at the center, a task Whitlow was ready to pursue until the full truth was uncovered. Immediately after CODIS identified Stephen Mark Rudd as the source of the DNA sample found on Kayla Turner's body, Sharon Whitlow turned back to the original 2003 case files for a comprehensive reinvestigation. She understood that the DNA match was a critical breakthrough, but to build a solid prosecution case in court, every old detail needed to be recovered and reconstructed, from the notes of the original investigators to the exact timeline of Kayla's last sighting. No step could be skipped. Whitlow spread out the entire file on her desk: crime scene reports, interrogation transcripts, the initial suspect list, maps of the Spring Creek Trail area, and even handwritten sketches from nearly 2 decades ago. Each document reflected a moment in the initial investigation, and despite the technological limitations of the time, the previous investigators had recorded a wealth of valuable information. She read every line, scanned every detail, trying to find points that couldn't be explained or fully analyzed back then. One of the most important steps was reconstructing the timeline of the day Kayla disappeared. From the old files, Whitlow confirmed Kayla left school in the late afternoon, and was last seen entering the start of Spring Creek Trail. The window between when she left school and when her family reported her missing was the critical period, and Whitlow used 2003 local maps to re-establish the entire route Kayla might have taken. She compared it with current map data to ensure paths, trails and residential areas from that time hadn't changed in the records. Next, Whitlow focused on analyzing Rudd's location at the time of the crime. Old files showed that Rudd's mother lived in a house directly across from Lesher Middle School, where Rudd was known to visit occasionally. In 2003, Rudd had no stable employment record, making it hard to pinpoint exactly where he was. Whitlow reviewed all the records from old interviews, neighbors, locals around the school, vague witnesses who had reported seeing a man loitering in the area in the weeks before Kayla's disappearance. When cross-referencing descriptions with Rudd's identification details from that time, many matches emerged more clearly than they had in two. From reconstructing the timeline, Whitlow assessed that Rudd had ample opportunity to approach Kayla on the very route she usually took home. She noted the most likely times Rudd could have been at Spring Creek Trail on the afternoon of the crime, cross-referencing with old file events like Kayla's school dismissal time, when witnesses passed the trail, and the estimated time the body was moved to Horsetooth Mountain Park. Once the timeline analysis was clearer, Whitlow moved on to the original suspect list. This list had caused much debate during the 2003 investigation, when there wasn't enough evidence to tie anyone definitively. But with the new DNA profile, Whitlow could systematically eliminate the remaining suspects. Modern technology allowed her to compare DNA samples from those previously suspected, many of whom had provided samples after later arrests or trials in other cases. With just a few cross-checks, more than half the list was immediately ruled out. Updated CODIS samples from others also didn't match the crime scene DNA. By the end of the process, only one person couldn't be eliminated: Stephen Mark Rudd. From the old notes, Whitlow also found a key detail. When questioned in 2003, Rudd had no clear alibi. Police had suspected him at the time but lacked scientific grounds to pursue further. In an era without cameras, direct witnesses or advanced DNA technology, temporarily removing Rudd from suspicion was unavoidable. However, with current data, all those ambiguities from back then now converged on a single direction. Upon completing the review of old files and timeline reconstruction, Whitlow concluded that all indirect and direct evidence pointed to Rudd, and with the absolute DNA match, the investigation needed to shift to an expanded phase to fully solidify the entire picture of his criminal actions on the day Kayla disappeared. The case had now reached a pivotal point from identifying the suspect to proving each of his actions in committing the crime. With the review of old files and timeline analysis, leaving Stephen Mark Rudd as the sole remaining primary suspect, Sharon Whitlow moved to the next step, re-interviewing all witnesses from the cross-referencing old statements with new data was essential to solidify the crime picture and uncover details overlooked due to technological and investigative limitations at the time. If in 2003 police could only conclude that Rudd was in the area, Whitlow now needed to prove his behavior before Kayla's disappearance wasn't coincidental but fit the pattern of a predator. The first witnesses recalled were residents around Lesser Middle School, those who had seen or heard about Rudd in the period before Kayla vanished. This time, instead of the general questions from 20 years ago, Whitlow asked more pointed ones, based on the new DNA match knowledge. This approach helped some recall more details than they had originally shared. One resident near the Spring Creek Trail entrance said that, a few weeks before Kayla's disappearance, she had seen a man leaning against the fence near the school in the late afternoon, watching students as they left. When shown a photo of a younger Rudd, she admitted the man that day looked very much like him. Another, long retired, said he had seen Rudd walking around the school area multiple times, but at the time thought he was just visiting his mother. These small but consistent details helped Whitlow establish that Rudd had spent significant time around the areas Kayla frequented. Next, Whitlow contacted those interviewed in the early days after Kayla's disappearance, including trail walkers, residents near the trail, and a few students from back then. Some no longer remembered clearly or had moved away, but there were still notable accounts. One woman recalled walking her dog one afternoon near the time of the disappearance and encountering a man walking toward her on the trail, with an unnatural stare that made her pull her dog closer. When shown Rudd's photo provided by Whitlow, she said he looked a lot like that man. But the most significant discovery came when Whitlow reached a woman who still lived in Fort Collins but had moved to another state years earlier. When asked about 203, she hesitated for a moment before admitting that she had been attacked by Rudd in 2001, but never reported it to police, out of fear for her family's reputation. The attack didn't cause serious injury, but Rudd's behavior left a strong impression. She described how he approached from behind, tried to restrain her, and only fled when she fought back fiercely. This description closely matched the marks found on Kayla's body. A quick approach, close contact, using strong force to control the victim. This behavioral pattern added to Rudd's profile. He not only frequently appeared around Lesser Middle School, but had a prior history of attacking a woman with a nearly identical method. As the new statements and scattered pieces of information connected, Whitlow realized she was facing a clear behavioral pattern. Rudd tended to observe and stalk victims before striking, especially young women or minors. He appeared multiple times around the school, watching students leave, and had a precedent of attacking a woman near the trail area. His modus operandi approaching in low-traffic spots, following familiar victims, attacking quickly, and moving the victim to a remote location, perfectly fit what police had found in Kayla's case. Although these statements couldn't replace the DNA evidence, they played a crucial supporting role in the overall file. They showed Rudd's behavior wasn't random or coincidental, but a repeat of a dangerous pattern. With the newly gathered information and the combination of biological evidence and witness accounts, Whitlow was ready for the next phase, reconstructing the criminal behavior and geography to clarify every step of Rudd's movements on that fateful day. After gathering new statements and identifying a behavioral pattern consistent with Stephen Mark Rudd, Sharon Whitlow moved on to the next step in the investigative process: criminal behavior and geographic profile. This phase required combining forensic data, criminal psychology, and the terrain characteristics of Fort Collins, to more accurately reconstruct how Rudd might have approached, attacked, and moved Kayla Turner on the day she disappeared. To firmly conclude that Rudd was not only a DNA match suspect, but the actual perpetrator, Whitlow had to prove that each step of his movements was logical and aligned with objective factors. The first step was identifying the most likely abduction point along Kayla's walking route. Based on the timeline reconstructed from old records and new statements, Whitlow focused on the intersection between the residential area and the start of Spring Creek Trail, where Kayla was last seen. This area matched Rudd's attack behavior, deserted in the late afternoon, with trees providing cover and multiple side paths. It was also the closest location to where Rudd had frequently been spotted according to local residents. According to geographic profiling experts, this was the hotspot with the highest likelihood of victim access. Whitlow marked the sections of the path Kayla might have taken at the time of the attack, then compared them to Rudd's confirmed behavior in the 2001 assault: approaching from behind, quick control, choosing low traffic location. Details from the 2003 crime scene, particularly the soil and vegetation found on Kayla's clothing, also matched the terrain in the middle section of Spring Creek Trail, where sparse forest intermixed with low bushes. From this, Whitlow sketched a plausible scenario. Rudd observed Kayla from a distance, approached on a secluded trail section, then subdued and removed her from the area in a short time frame. The next phase of analysis involved simulating the offender's route to transport the body to Horsetooth Mountain Park, where Kayla's remains were discovered. Whitlow used 203 traffic maps, when major changes had not yet occurred, to determine the least noticeable route the kidnapper could take. The most logical path was from Spring Creek Trail to County Road 38E, then northwest toward the Horsetooth Forest area. The distance was not excessive, and those roads at the time had few cameras or streetlights, ideal for undetected movement. Forensic analysis results of soil and fabric samples from Kayla's clothing further supported Whitlow's assessment. The soil on Kayla's clothes matched that along the trail leading into Horsetooth, not the type near the residential area where she vanished. This indicated the body was moved to the forest area quickly after the attack. Bruises and soft tissue injuries noted in the autopsy report were consistent with the victim being transported or dragged over rough terrain. Another factor suggesting Rudd took Kayla to a more remote location before selecting the disposal site. Whitlow also evaluated the behavioral plausibility based on common psychological traits of sexual offenders. Opportunistic attackers like Rudd typically choose a secondary location for the assault and body disposal to reduce detection risk and separate the initial scene from the actual crime site. Horsetooth Mountain Park, with its vast terrain, low afternoon traffic and numerous small trails, was a fitting choice for this pattern. This allowed Whitlow to conclude that the route from Spring Creek Trail to Horsetooth was not random but aligned with criminal behavioral logic. Finally, when all elements were synthesized, timeline, geography, forensics, witness statements and behavioral pattern, the picture became clear. Every piece of data pointed to Rudd. Not only was there a DNA match, but the entire sequence of actions before, during and after the crime fit his psychological profile. His frequent presence near the school area, prior assault history, familiarity with routes, and ability to select remote locations all reinforced that Rudd was the perpetrator. With these conclusions, Whitlow completed the behavioral analysis phase, a critical foundation for the next stage, strengthening physical evidence and preparing the arrest warrant application. Immediately after behavioral and geographic analysis showed Stephen Mark Rudd fit the entire crime pattern, Sharon Whitlow moved to the next step, strengthening physical evidence. This was the most crucial part before seeking an arrest warrant, as even though the DNA match was decisive, a complete case file still needed tight links between forensics, timeline and behavior to ensure persuasiveness in court. The first evidence Whitlow re-examined was fibers collected from Kayla's clothing and the small gray fabric strands on the victim's shirt had undergone preliminary analysis, but technology at the time was insufficient to pinpoint the exact source. Now, with advanced microscopic analysis equipment, the lab could more precisely determine fiber structure, polymer composition and weave pattern. Results showed these fibers did not match common types in Kayla's clothing, but unexpectedly aligned with samples from the rear seat upholstery of the car model Rudd owned in 2003, an old sedan documented in police records from his interrogation in another case. Vehicle maintenance records from that year indicated Rudd had never replaced the interior, so comparison samples from the later incident remain valid. When the fibers matched to near certainty, Whitlow viewed this as the first physical link, proving Kayla had been inside Rudd's vehicle, something he consistently denied when questioned in 2000. Police had seized his shoes then but did not analyze them deeply since that incident was unconnected to Kayla. However, proper evidence storage allowed Whitlow to retest them nearly 2 decades later. When soil from Rudd's shoes was compared to soil from the scene where Kayla's body was found, the lab confirmed matches in minerals, particle structure and environmental markers, characteristic of a specific area in Horsetooth Mountain Park. This indicated Rudd had been in the mountain forest where Kayla was discovered around the time of the crime. While being in Horsetooth was not unusual for locals, combined with DNA, fibers, and witnesses, it became a key component in the chain of incriminating logic. Finally, Whitlow reviewed the timeline of Kayla's disappearance using verified data. Witness accounts, Rudd's 2003 movement records, information from people near the school area, and the window when Kayla was reported missing. These points overlap clearly. The time Kayla left school, aligned with the period Rudd was often seen near his mother's house. The 20-30-minute window when Kayla vanished matched the time Rudd was not seen by anyone else. The shortest route from Spring Creek Trail to Horsetooth was fully within range for Rudd to travel by personal vehicle without notice. Forensic marks on Kayla's clothing matched her being placed in a vehicle and transported to the forest area. When Whitlow compiled all evidence, DNA match, fiber match, soil match, logical timeline, matching behavioral pattern, the chain became airtight with no room for coincidence. Each piece alone was minor, but together they formed a unified picture. Stephen Mark Rudd approached Kayla, subdued her, placed her in his vehicle, and took her to Horsetooth where he committed the crime. At this point, the case file was strong enough to submit for an arrest warrant. Whitlow finalized the comprehensive report, including all forensic analysis, timeline, and witness details, marking the end of the physical evidence phase and opening the next step, formally arresting the man who had evaded responsibility for 2 decades. Once the chain of physical evidence was fully strengthened, Sharon Whitlow knew the time to act had arrived. Immediately after completing the comprehensive report, she submitted the file to the Larimer County District Attorney's Office to request an arrest warrant for Stephen Mark Rudd. The DNA, fiber, soil, timeline, and behavioral analysis evidence were all presented clearly, forming a preliminary charging document with strong legal weight. The major crimes prosecutor reviewed the file quickly and agreed there was probable cause for the warrant. An emergency hearing was held with the on-duty judge. There, Whitlow and the district attorney's representative outlined all key points: absolute DNA match, direct physical links between Kayla and Rudd, and data proving his presence in likely crime areas at the time of Kayla's disappearance. The judge signed the arrest warrant without requesting additional information, a clear sign the case file was highly convincing. With the warrant signed, the task force responsible for execution was immediately activated. Though the case had spanned nearly 20 years, approaching the suspect still required absolute caution, as no one knew if Rudd might resist. Whitlow coordinated with vehicle tracking units and traffic records to locate Rudd's current position. Using vehicle registration data and traffic checkpoint information, they determined Rudd was living in a suburban area near Fountain, Colorado. In the following days, a surveillance team secretly monitored Rudd's movement habits, when he left home, places he frequented, and especially the vehicle he used. This information was critical to ensure a safe arrest, preventing any chance of flight or danger to the public. Initial observations showed Rudd lived a reclusive life with little neighbor interaction, making the team even more cautious. One morning, through traffic monitoring systems, surveillance detected Rudd leaving his residence earlier than usual. He drove south along. Positioning data showed his vehicle moving steadily without stopping at familiar spots. Recognizing the possibility Rudd was leaving the area, Whitlow ordered intensified surveillance and directed the arrest team to positions near Trinidad, a small town several hours' drive from Fort Collins. As Rudd's vehicle entered the northern outskirts of Trinidad, the arrest team was ready. They selected an open stretch of road with light traffic, ensuring enough space to block the vehicle without endangering other drivers. When Rudd slowed to pull into a rest stop, law enforcement vehicles appeared from both directions, quickly surrounding him. With local police support, the arrest warrant was executed in seconds. Rudd was ordered out of the vehicle, to place his hands behind his head, and had no opportunity to resist. The arrest proceeded safely, with no injuries to anyone. After being handcuffed, Rudd was read his Miranda rights, and transported in a secure vehicle back to Larimer County Detention. At that moment, he remained silent, did not request an attorney, and offered no explanation. As the transport vehicle headed back, Whitlow fully recognized this was only the beginning of the prosecution and trial phase, but the feeling that the case had finally reached the truth after 20 years was undeniable. Rudd had been arrested, and from that moment, he no longer had any chance to evade responsibility for what happened to Kayla Turner. Immediately after Stephen Mark Rudd was escorted to the Larimer County Detention Center, Sharon Whitlow and a veteran investigator were assigned to conduct the initial interrogation. The goal was not only to hear Rudd's responses, but also to directly confront him with all the collected scientific evidence, from DNA and forensic physical evidence, to the timeline, to test whether he could offer any reasonable explanation. In the interrogation room, Rudd maintained a silent and guarded demeanor, his eyes revealing little emotion. Whitlow began by presenting the basic information about the arrest warrant and his rights. Then she presented the strongest evidence. The DNA result. In front of Rudd she placed the printed DNA profile, analyzed using new technology, and the comparison with the sample recovered from Kayla Turner's body in tooth. With a perfect match, there was no room for error. Whitlow explained the retesting process, the chain of custody, and the absolute match returned by CODIS. Rudd remained silent, but his face showed signs of tension. It was a familiar reaction from suspects who knew the scientific evidence was against them. Whitlow continued with the physical evidence. First, the fiber analysis results. Fibers on Kayla's clothing matched the interior of the vehicle Rudd used in 2003. She placed microscope images of the samples next to lab documents confirming their origin. Next, the soil match. Soil from Rudd's shoes, seized in a 2003 incident, matched the distinctive soil at Horsetooth Mountain Park, where Kayla's body was found. Each piece of information was presented clearly, without unnecessary interpretation, just undeniable forensic facts. Faced with this physical evidence, Rudd began shifting his posture but still refused to respond. Whitlow then moved to the timeline. She presented the key time points based on witness statements, geographic analysis, and behavioral data. Rudd had been seen around Lusser Middle School in the period before Kayla's disappearance, with no reasonable alibi, and had sufficient time to transport the victim from Spring Creek Trail to Horsetooth. All the time points aligned logically. There were no gaps large enough to allow an innocent explanation for Rudd's presence. When asked to explain why his DNA was on Kayla's body, why soil from his shoes matched the crime scene, or why fibers from his vehicle were on the victim's clothing, Rudd only repeated one response: "I don't know." It wasn't a denial, nor was it a confession. It was evidence that he had no coherent story to counter the forensics. For a suspect cornered by scientific evidence, silence or vague denials were tantamount to defeat. As the interrogation ended, Whitlow left the room with certainty. Every piece of data, scientific, logical, and behavioral, unanimously pointed to Rudd as the person who murdered Kayla Turner. The session didn't need a confession. It only reinforced that Rudd was powerless against the irrefutable evidence. Rudd's complete inability to provide a reasonable explanation during the interrogation led to the entire case file being transferred directly to the Larimer County District Attorney's Office for prosecution. The decisive DNA evidence, perfectly matching forensic physical evidence, and clearly reconstructed timeline created a foundation so strong that the prosecution team faced no obstacles in filing charges. Rudd was indicted on the two most serious counts: first-degree murder and sexual assault on a minor. The pre-trial phase became the stage where the entire investigation was presented systematically and tightly. The file was submitted to the judge and Rudd's defense team, detailed DNA profiles from the new testing technology, fibers on Kayla's clothing matching Rudd's vehicle interior, soil from his shoes matching the type at Horsetooth Mountain Park, and a timeline diagram showing he was at key locations on the day Kayla disappeared. Forensic conclusions, autopsy reports, and the two-decade chain of custody were all proven transparent, leaving no gaps for dispute. Rudd's defense attorneys tried to find weaknesses in the case, but the evidence links were too solid. DNA was the central thread, supported by matching details in physical evidence, while behavioral patterns and witness statements formed independent layers of proof. There was no avenue to challenge it without putting themselves at a severe disadvantage. Taking the case to a jury trial would almost certainly result in a total loss. From that disadvantaged position, the defense had to consider a plea deal to minimize damage for their client. The prosecution's offer was clear: plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of life without parole, and in return, the court would not pursue harsher penalties, sparing the victim's family a lengthy and traumatic trial. Negotiations took place over multiple closed sessions. Prosecutors presented the indisputable evidence, while Rudd's attorneys explained to him that every defense strategy had no chance of surviving the certainty of the forensic file. Rudd was shown the charging documents again. DNA, physical evidence photos, behavioral analysis, nothing deviated from the overall conclusion. In the end, Rudd agreed to sign the deal. At the plea hearing before the judge, he confirmed his guilty plea in a quiet, cold voice, showing no remorse or resistance. The criminal acts were recorded once more in his own words, a legal procedure validating the plea deal and ending the prolonged dispute. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. No chance for sentence reduction, no chance for conditional release. The sentence marked the end of a 2-decade evasion and the final step in delivering justice for Kayla Turner. From here the story shifts to the case's impact on the community, where the pain of a loss too great and too long still echoes. The life without parole sentence for Stephen Mark Rudd quickly spread throughout Fort Collins, stirring strong emotions in a community that had followed the case since. Many older residents still remembered the moment Kayla Turner disappeared, and the somber atmosphere that bedecked the area around Lusser Middle School during the search. The truth revealed after 2 decades brought relief to many, but also resurfaced the pain and shock at the brutality a 14-year-old girl had endured. Not just Kayla's family, but those who lived near Spring Creek Trail felt as though a loop left unclosed had finally come to an end. In community meetings and local forums, many expressed gratitude to the CBI cold case team for providing answers to a question that had lingered for nearly half a lifetime. Residents shared that they never thought the case would be solved after so many years without new leads. The persistence of investigators and advances in science restored many people's faith in justice. Late, but complete. At the same time, the Kayla Turner case had a significant impact on cold case procedures across Colorado. Authorities recognized the importance of long-term evidence preservation and the need for periodic reviews of backlogged files as technology advanced. Following the investigation's success, CBI proposed that all cold cases with biological evidence be re-examined whenever major DNA technology improvements occurred. This policy was quickly adopted by many counties as a necessary measure to ensure no case was forgotten, simply because earlier science wasn't advanced enough. The case also sparked broader discussions about the role of DNA technology in solving old cases. The difference between 2003 technology and today's was seen as a prime example. Samples once considered useless, fibers, soil, fragmented DNA, now became key pieces in solving a 20-year mystery. Colorado lawmakers referenced the Kayla Turner case when debating expanded DNA collection regulations for more offense categories. For them, what happened here proved one clear thing. Forensic technology isn't just an investigative tool, it's the door to justice for victims who can no longer speak. The greatest impact was that the Kayla Turner file was incorporated into official training programs for cold case investigators in Colorado. It was one of the few cases with all the typical elements: long-aged evidence, initial technological limitations, a suspect previously identified but cleared due to lack of proof, and ultimately solved through modern forensics, combined with behavioral analysis modeling. New investigators learned how to reread old files, spot overlooked signs, evaluate evidence from a modern perspective, and integrate multiple forensic branches. The Kayla file became a real-world lesson that no case is truly unsolvable, only that science hadn't yet been strong enough. When the sentence was handed down and Rudd was transferred to federal prison, the case closed legally, but its echoes lingered in the Fort Collins community. People looked back 20 years and realized that scientific progress, investigators' persistence, and the family's unwavering hope had together created a fitting conclusion. Though nothing could bring Kayla back, justice was finally served, and the lessons from the case would live on in every training session, every cold case file, and every investigation pursuing the truth. Looking at the Kayla Turner story in today's American context, it's not just a case solved after 20 years, but a very specific reminder of how communities, the justice system, and individuals can and should act. First, the fact that a woman assaulted by Rudd in 2001 didn't report it to police is a crucial detail. In today's America, where the Me Too movement has changed how society views victims, that story reminds us that silence often only protects the perpetrator. If that assault had been reported, if Rudd's file had been opened earlier, Kayla might not have become a victim. The practical lesson: if you, your child, or a friend has been a victim of sexual assault or violence, seek support and report it to authorities, even years later. Today's system, from hotlines and counselors to victim advocates, is far better than 20 years ago. Second, Colorado's careful evidence storage and DNA retesting program shows that justice can be delayed, but not necessarily denied. Kayla's family had to wait for expanded DNA laws after 2018 for Rudd's profile to be entered into CUDIS, for NGS technology to become powerful enough. This sends a practical message to families of victims in America. Stay in touch with investigators, update when laws or technology change, and don't treat a cold case label as the end. Finally, the Fort Collins community initially only vaguely noticed a man loitering around the school. Today, with schools still vulnerable, reporting unusual behavior around children, not with panic, but through official responsible channels, is a very specific thing every American citizen can do to prevent another Rudd from emerging. Thank you for following the entire 2-decade case resolution journey. If you'd like to continue exploring stories of justice brought to light through science and persistence, please subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video, where we'll keep uncovering files once thought dormant, but still waiting to be told.